All right. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us again on a Tuesday evening here for our Resilient Future series. So Chris Gilmore here from Chris Outdoors. For those of you that have not joined the series yet, just to give you a little bit of a quick background of what we're getting up to here and what it's been all about. But this series is hosted in partnership between myself, Chris Outdoors, and Earth Activist Training. Chris Outdoors is all about outdoor education, nature awareness, helping people develop the skills of resiliency. So things like growing food and emergency preparedness, things of that nature, as well as being able to read the story of the land. And Earth Activist Training, I'm not going to say too much about because they're actually our guests on tonight's call. So we'll be bringing on Starhawk and Charles Williams in a moment here. And the series really came together as we were starting to really just pick up on, some of the overwhelm that people were feeling around the state of the world right now. There's a lot going on right now. Things are changing fast, whether it's the economy, whether it's the social structure, technology, the environment, climate change. There's a lot to digest. And I know it can be really overwhelming for some people. So the intention of this series was to pool together and create a space that we could come together collectively and face, arguably some of the biggest challenges of our time from a proactive and a positive perspective. So we've basically been facilitating these conversations around, knowing that there's so much going on and it can be overwhelming. What are positive steps we can do as individuals, as families, and in our community to prepare ourselves to adapt as the world changes, and to hopefully contribute to our communities and to the world and making it a better place. So that's kind of the theme and where we've been going. So if you're just joining the series, or if you've been following along with all the emails I'm sending out right now, each one has a link at the bottom to it, to all of the past sessions. We've had some really great ones, and we've been trying to cover a whole swath of different topics. You'll notice, we've moved into permaculture, we've gotten into finances, we've done some emergency preparedness, we've done some emotional and mental resiliency. We've been really trying to do a wide kind of range of different topics that all kind of fall under this overall holistic tool set, I'll say, for a changing world and for a changing future. So anyways, that's what it's all about. I'm going to introduce our guests momentarily here. But just to kind of go over a couple of logistics, this is the fifth call in the series. And there's two more left coming up after this. Next week, we have on Andrew McMartin from the Pine Project. Andrew's passion is working with youth in the outdoors. So we're going to be talking a little bit about nature connection and working with nature to build our resiliency, both emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and talking about preparing youth for uncertainty. Because I know there's a lot of anxiety amongst youth right now, and the Pine Project specialty is helping youth develop capacity for a changing world. So that's coming up next Tuesday. And then the week after that, we have Caleb Musgrave from Canadian Bushcraft, a good friend of mine, and my own wife, Laura Gilmore. And they're going to be talking about modern day homesteading as well as foraging and harvesting food from the land as a way to improve our food security and our self-reliance and thus resiliency. So yeah, all of those sessions are coming up. And to start us off to tonight, Charles and, I should just say too, we're going to be between an hour and a half tonight. It kind of varies a little bit week to week. We've been keeping it a little bit informal there. I'm not exactly sure how long Star and Charles are planning to go for, I'm going to pass it over to them in just a minute, and they'll basically be taking the show for the rest of the night. But before we get started, and before I intro them, to kind of keep with the tradition for those of you that are following along, we've been starting off each one of these sessions with a little bit of gratitude, and just kind of chatting about how gratitude in and of itself is a tool set of resiliency, and really a survival skill. It's become a daily practice of mine that's really helped me through some challenging times. So I'm going to just slow down for a second here, take a short little breath. This week, every single evening as I come home from work, I've been going and harvesting big buckets that are hanging off of our maple trees, and I've been collecting maple sap. So on Sunday this week, we're going to be boiling it all day long. We're going to spend the whole day around the fire, and we're going to be boiling that sap down into maple syrup. So the gratitude that I would like to start off tonight is, one, a gratitude for the maple trees. And they're many, many gifts to the human world and what they share with the rest of the planets that the rest of the species we share this with. But man, what a cool thing, after this long winter, to be able to drink that sap just full of minerals right from the trees feels so invigorating, and it fills my life force energy. So I'm super thankful for the sap, and I'm super thankful for the ability to make this beautiful sweet sugar from the land. The other thing I'd like to share, and I'm actually going to share a link right now for folks. And this is actually a link. I mentioned Caleb Musgrave, who's going to be coming on for our very last episode on April 11th in this series. But here's a little link. Maybe don't watch it right now, but just open it up in another tab and you can check it out later. But Caleb is from Hiawatha First Nation. He's a Anishinaabe woodsman. And I've been thinking a lot, just about the number of skills that Caleb's ancestors and his peoples would have passed on to, my ancestors and people from, my background as we came over here. And definitely, the whole process of sugaring and maple syrup would have been one of those. So I want to just put a gratitude out to the Anishinaabe peoples and all of the First Nations peoples that are involved in this practice and that have kept it alive over the years, because it's such an honor to be able to engage in it myself. This video right now is an amazing interview that somebody did with Caleb Musgrave. It's about 45 minutes long on YouTube, and he takes you through the traditional Anishinaabe indigenous, talks about the traditional and modern ways of processing maple syrup. So if that's of interest to you, there's a link right there. And with all that said, I'm going to invite you to share, what are you feeling grateful for in the chat tonight? Please throw that in there and let us know what you're feeling grateful for tonight. So I'm going to bring Star and Charles on in just a minute here. So Star and Charles, you can even jump on stage if you want. We'll pass it over in just a second here. And so tonight's call is around this theme of diversity and community. And I'm really excited to hear what Charles and Star are going to say. I have no idea where they're actually planning to go with the conversation tonight. But I can tell you, when COVID came around, as somebody that's done a lot of training in emergency preparedness and somebody that actually consults and works in that industry, the physical logistics of hunkering down in place were actually really easy. When a lot of people were panicking about food and things shutting down, we felt quite prepared for that. What I found really challenging during it, the hardest part of the whole pandemic for me, was the social breakdown that I saw amongst my community during it. And when disaster strikes, one thing that really gives me faith in the human spirit is we see people from all sides of the spectrum generally tend to rally around together, and they recognize, what's truly important in life, the other lives, the people we share this with. And I've witnessed that so many times, whether people lean right or left, when disaster strikes, they tend to be helping each other and not conflicted. But when we have these kind of longer drawn out disasters, like economic disasters and climate change and, kind of the grind of day-to-day life that sometimes feel, it becomes a lot easier to start butting heads. And out of all the things in this series that we're chatting about, this is a topic I'm super interested in. How do we, when we come from such diverse and different backgrounds, we maybe have different values, we maybe have even different visions of the world that we want. I've got a lot of personal questions around, how do we come together in cohesion, and how do we live in peace with each other? So I'm really excited to where this conversation is going to go tonight. And thank you so much, Star and Charles, for joining us to take this one on. And I don't actually know where they're going, so maybe I didn't set that up perfectly with what I shared. I'm just kind of sharing what's on my mind. So if you go in another direction, I totally get it too. But I just thought I'd share some of my reflections and just how this overall theme of diversity and community fits in with the theme of the resilient future. So I would like to just ask you both, though, what you're feeling grateful for tonight before you dive into your presentation.
I'm sitting here in the redwoods, and we do have maples here. I'm told we could tap them, but I've never tried. I'm also grateful for maple syrup, even though it doesn't come from here. But we do have these amazing redwoods, and sometimes I just look up at them. They're just so incredibly giant and huge that when you really stop and think, this enormous thing built its body basically out of air and water and sunlight. I am really grateful for that miracle of photosynthesis and for all the plants and all the trees.
Today, I'm particularly grateful for my kiddo. I have a 7-year-old son who is the embodiment of curiosity, which is amazing to see unabashed curiosity of the world and a willingness to ask questions. It's just an inspiration to me, and I love having him around and going out and looking at the world around us.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to jump off stage here and pass it over to the two of you for the evening. If anybody is having tech issues with sound or video, I'd encourage you just to log out and log back in, and sometimes that fixes it. Starhawk, I also noticed that you have a little bit of an echo, so I'm wondering if you even want to just jump off stage and come back on, and we'll see if that fixes that as well. But we'll pass it over to you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
I'll try that.
Well, they're jumping on and off stage. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. So today I'm coming to you from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And this is in Nova Scotia. Eskegiwagik is the area that I'm in particular. And I would encourage you to put in the chat what traditional territories you're in if you know. If you don't, I put a link in the chat. You can go check it out sometime and figure out what territory you're in. Even if you know what territory you're in, I encourage you to check out the Native Lands map. It's an amazing map that shows where different territories are. And unlike colonial maps that have like stark boundaries where one ends and the other starts, it shows the overlap because there weren't hard-edged boundaries, yours and mine. You know, there were all these overlapping, shifting, and there's an amazing set of resources on that page. So I encourage you to go there, take a look at it, see if you can learn some of the native words for plants and animals in your area. Get to know some of the culture that's around. So I encourage you, when you put your traditional territory in the chat, also put the settler name too, because it's really good for us to learn the name of both. Because, you know, if I say, you know, I'm from, you know, Nova Scotia, people might know where that is. Or if somebody says, oh, you're, you know, from Georgia, and you say, oh, is that the country or the state? Like, we get to orient ourselves around that. It's really good to start to learn other names. And one way to do that is linking them with what we already know, right? That's part of how learning happens. So I encourage you to put the traditional territory, if you know what it is, and the settler name that goes along with it. Also, as we acknowledge where we are, like, I'm in Nova Scotia. You know, it's also Mi'kma'ki. It's, you know, also the place where lots of people came in, and this is really a cultural focal point for Canada. There's a lot of immigration here, especially in the early African Nova Scotians that settled here and struggled here. So it's good to remember all the people that have stewarded the land, the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous. As we move forward, it gives us a sense of place. So welcome everybody from wherever you're at. And as people are putting that in, invite everybody to just take a moment and take a breath and settle in. With your eyes open or closed, just allow yourself to relax and notice how you feel right now. Notice how you feel sitting in the chair you're sitting in, or on the floor, or maybe you're standing. Just notice what it feels like. Can you feel the force of gravity that tugs on us all the time, but sometimes we forget? What if that tug was an invitation? What if it was a non-verbal invitation for you to let some of that energy that is you just slide down, you know, like sap from the trees into a root? Like, can you let some of your energy just drizzle down through the floor and into the earth below you? Can you imagine roots maybe springing forth from whatever parts of your body are touching, you know, the floor, the chair, the couch, wherever you're sitting or standing? And just let some roots extend down. Can you breathe those into the earth? As your roots go down, what do they encounter? What does it feel like? Is it warm or damp? Cold, dry, rocky? What's it feel like? What's that earth under you feel like? Can you sense an energy moving? Maybe it's a sleepy wintertime energy. Maybe it's a quickening of the spring. Maybe it's warm already. What's the earth feel like where you're at right now? I invite you just to draw some of the energy of the earth up. Just invite it to come up. And see if you can breathe some of that in. Just get connected to where you're at right now. Let it fill your body like water in a glass, sucking up through straws, sucking up through your legs to fill up, knees, hips. Can you breathe it up into your belly, up around your heart? You breathe some energy up into your shoulders and down your arms, hands, up into your neck, head, face. Can we breathe some of that up and let it reach out like branches from a tree, rooted here, branches that reach up and sprout out of the roof and the windows and stretch out into the sky. Maybe catch some sunlight or starlight or moonlight. Maybe leaves rustling in the wind, getting rained on or snowed on. Just breathe in some of that fresh air, the energy from the heavens. And connected with the earth below and the sky above. Notice what you hear. Notice what you taste or smell, maybe a little, the last meal. And if you haven't opened your eyes, I invite you to open your eyes and look around and notice what you see. Maybe it's a place you're really familiar with. You know it very well. Maybe it's a place you haven't spent a lot of time. Just notice, is there anything new or different you haven't noticed? Or maybe there's something you haven't noticed in a while. Just look around and notice that familiar place that you're getting to know once again tonight. And grounded and connected, I say welcome. Welcome to tonight's session.
And into the session, am I still having an echo? I am still having an echo.
Not too bad.
Okay. I don't know why. I don't have anything else on, so hopefully not too bad. But let's just feel the web of connection that we make. I'm looking at the chat and all of these different places and lands that people come from, all of the ancestors that represents people from all over the continent, all over Turtle Island. And just think of us making a web of connection. That's like a giant circle. If we were together in physical space, we could all hold hands. And we can't hold hands here, but we can kind of imagine holding hands and send that energetic link out through this web. And our circle is cast. And into this circle, we like to begin by honoring the 4 elements, taking a breath, and giving some honor and gratitude to the air. You know, the air is such an intimate partner. It goes deep inside of us. We breathe it in and breathe it out. It gets passed from lung to lung. The trees take it in and use it to build their bodies and breathe out the oxygen that we take in. Just take a breath in with gratitude. And breathe it out again as a conscious gift of love to the green world. And welcome air. And think about fire and all the flows of energy all around the world. And that sunlight that showers down on us with this incredible generosity of energy that fuels all the life processes on Earth. And take a breath and let's just honor that fire and say, welcome, fire. Thank you, fire. And the water. You know, the elders always tell us water is sacred, water is life. Right now, I'm in California and we're getting so much blessed rain. It's amazing that this great gift of life just falls down out of the sky, literally showers us with its blessing. So let's take a breath and say, welcome, water. Thank you, water. And earth, that solid stuff under our feet that grows the plants, that provides the nutrients, that harbors the living ecology that sustains life on earth. We say, welcome, earth. Thank you, earth. And finally, there's spirit in the center of the circle, that intangible thing that links all the other things, that brings it all together. The spirit of creativity, of compassion, of love, of awe and reverence and appreciation for the beauty of the natural world. And let's say, welcome, spirit. Thank you, spirit. And now our circle is cast. So, what's next, Charles?
We're going to talk about diversity and identity. And really, this came about, as Chris was saying, we're looking at a time when there's so much going on and so much struggle and like concern about the environment and what's going on and like how are we going to make it all work. And one of the things that Starhawk and I were talking about is all of the silos, that like the divisions that are happening, where you have this group and that group, and there's a lot of like this fighting between the factions, the left and the right, and there's this conflict of the culture wars and like, all of this. Especially if you listen to the news, it's like super like, hyper divisive. And really, we're looking, from a permaculture perspective and saying, look at the natural environment. Like, yes, there's all this variety out there. But it's collaborative, right? Like you look at a forest, old growth forest, it's super diverse, and like there's this incredible sense of collaboration. Yes, some things are in competition, but it's not the same that we see in our social environments. We really are talking about like what's going on, like how do we do this, and how do we have collaborative groups? How do we make change? How do we connect and bring large groups of people together to solve some of these really big challenges that we're facing? So that's kind of where we came to tonight. We're like, well, let's really look at diversity and like inclusion, how we collaborate and connect and work together. So that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So I think we're going to start with talking a bit about identity. I don't know, Star, if you were going to lead off on that. I was.
Yeah. I always think about this story. A friend of mine told me, who was a flight attendant, about being on a flight, and the guy in first class who was a very well-known politician and was super drunk. And he talked about how the flight attendants refused to serve him any more alcohol. And he got really angry, and he jumped up out of his seat and stood there in the aisle and yelled at her and said, "Young lady, do you know who I am?" And the flight attendant just looked at him, rolled her eyes, turned to the whole crowd of the plane and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, can anyone help this man? He doesn't know who he is." I often think that we are a lot like that guy. Like, there's some deep way in which we don't know who we are. If we grew up in a traditional culture, we would, you might know who you are because you know what clan you come from and what tribe you come from. I once was on a panel in Spain with a woman who is an Australian Aboriginal person and a Maori woman from New Zealand. And I think the title of the panel was something like Reclaiming Our Ancestors. And they started off by reciting their ancestors like all the way back to the first canoe, generation upon generation upon generation. And I said, well, I know my ancestors. I know some stories back to my great-grandmother, maybe my great-great-grandmother on my mother's side. But a lot of that history for most of us has been lost. And Greg Castro, who is an Ohlone, a California Indian, was speaking once, and he was saying, if you're a California Indian, your identity is your place. And I think for a lot of us, our identity might partly be our place. I don't know, maybe some of you identify as Canadians, or we identify as Americans or Californians. I know out here in the hills where I live, there's a very strong sense of connection and identity for this particular place. But it's very different from the way Indigenous people would have lived in a place where the houses all had names as features of the landscape because they had been there for thousands of years and would, be rebuilt each time they started to get rot in them. So I think we're all hungry to know who we are and where we belong. And yet identity itself is really complex. It's not just one thing. I could say to you, I'm a woman. I could say to you, I come from a Jewish heritage. I could say to you, I am a practicing pagan. I can say I'm a permaculturalist. All of those are various facets of my identity. But we often try to put people into a box as one thing or another or another. And I think it's actually very destructive to be seen only as one piece of your identity, or to have pieces of who you are that are either invisible, or you can't show them, or you can't talk about them, or people don't want to see them or accept them. So I always like to start our groups by saying our intention is to create a space where we can really show up in the fullness of who we are as human beings and be seen and be valued, and ask people to support that intention. So we wanted to start with just a little bit about thinking about identity, because in order to have diversity, you kind of have to know who you are to know who you aren't, and what you're like in order to know what's different. So Charles, you want to tell them about the thing?
So what we're going to start with, we're going to do we're going to attempt the exercise. I've put in the chat a link to a Menti page. and we're going to make a little word cloud. And how this works is you'll log on. I'll start it here in a second. So you'll log on to that. You open another window in your browser, and then you can write some of your identities. And what I encourage you to write one identity per, you can put like up to 8 different identities, one per. So like don't write the same thing over and over. So like some of your identities, some of the things you might want to consider is innate qualities that you have, something that's innate to you, like, could be skin color, something that you might have gotten from your ancestors that got passed down. Could be physical characteristics, could be a function, something that you do. It could be a preference you have, Mac versus a PC user. It could be, some your station or your caste, depending on the culture you're in. There's lots of different aspects of our identity. So we're going to give everybody a chance this, and then we're going to put it up and we're going to take a look at it. So, yeah, I'll open that up and people can start filling it out.
Yeah, and as Charles was saying, you might think about your work. A lot of us identify with the role we might play in a family or a community. You might think about some aspects of your personality. You're an introvert, an extrovert. I think for some people, identity is, the brands that you like or the car that you drive, the sports team you're a fan of. It's fascinating to watch this.
One thing I like about this, it talks about who's in our group. Like, even though we don't know who's here really, we don't know the entirety of our group, but this gives us a sense of who's here. We might not know your name, but we're like start to get a sense of what the diversity of our group is. And some of these things, that even if I met you, if we were all in the same room, I wouldn't know this. Some of these things are visible that I would see, and some of them I wouldn't, unless I spent time with you or you told me. How this word cloud works is the things that are repeated more often get bigger. So the words that are larger are ones that more people identify in this group.
So if you look at that, Charles, I think if you mute when I talk, that might help the echo.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know how easy it is. There we go.
So how is that working better? I think so. I don't know why it's doing that for me. It doesn't seem to do it the other way, but that's the way it is. But just look at how complex the identities are within this group. I mean, my identity as a nearsighted person is I have to hold it up to even see what all of them are. Because a lot of times we'll look at a group and we'll say, oh, look, everybody's white. There's no diversity here. And I think it's very important to be aware when we have representation of different groups and when we don't. But I think it's also important to understand that we have tremendous diversity in any group. It might not be all the different kinds of diversity we'd like to have, but we have this real richness of who people are and all the complexities. As many identities as we have here, I bet if you sat down and started to list all the ways you identify, you'd come up with dozens and dozens of them just for yourself. So diversity is always there. We always have access to it. And one of the principles in ecology is that diversity generates resilience. You know, if you have a redwood forest with redwood trees and maybe an edge where there's some hardwoods, there's like some big leaf maples and some madrones and some bay laurels, and there's some Doug firs mixed in, and maybe some interesting odd little things that are more rare, like a California nutmeg there. Or maybe someone came down from further in the Northwest and planted a cedar that's out of its native habitat that grows here. You know, and you have understory plants, and you've got shrubs and huckleberries and native currants. And you get a bug or a pest and it comes through, it might take out one plant, but it's not going to be able to take out the whole forest. Whereas if you have a forest that's all genetically modified pines, all identical genetically, and you get a bug or a pest that can take out the whole thing. You know, the reason the Irish potato famine was so devastating was that they pretty much all grew the same variety of potato that was susceptible to the virus. So when we're thinking about things like our gardens, you know, we always think about planting diversity. Plants that play different roles in the system, plants that offer different things, plants that might be pollinators for different beneficial insects, other plants that might be larval food, some that might repel the insects that you don't want, nitrogen fixers that are going to bring fertility. All those things play their different roles in the ecosystem and help create resilience. And I think that's important in human ecosystems as well, that we live in an overarching culture that tends to be suspicious of diversity. It tends to say, oh, if you're not like me, you're bad. But really, we need those differences. And we need all of those different niches in our human society to be filled. So there's got to be, you know, room for the extrovert and the introvert, for the person who's fantastically good at math and great at detail, and the person who can barely add two numbers but maybe has a great connection to people. You know, the different heritages we come from, the different backgrounds can be a source of enrichment rather than a reason to be suspicious of each other. So in permaculture, we always like to think we're trying to take nature as our model, And to me, that's one of the great lessons that nature teaches us. If we embrace diversity instead of fearing it, we actually create a group that has a broader range of perspectives that's going to be smarter and wiser and much more resilient than a group where we are all very much the same. What are some of your thoughts, Charles?
Yeah, this ecology of that creates the resilience has to do with not just individuals, like, oh, I have a variety of things, but it has all these functional relationships. It is not just that you have variety of different things in the environment, but they have different ways to engage with each other. Oh, so this tree that photosynthesizes can give nutrients to this other plant to its mycorrhizal fungi. It's the relationship between the two. It's not just the fact that you have two trees. Like, oh, so you have these different plants that are different pollinators. This one can pollinate. You have two apple trees and they can pollinate each other, so you get fruit. It's about the relationship between them all, right? So it's like, what are the relationships that we have? So we look at our communities and like, how do we make a diverse movement? How do we get people together? When have you worked in a team that's worked really well? Well, what are the relationships? I think there's a lot about how do we have these functional relationships? How do we connect with each other in a way that's meaningful? And when Chris was talking earlier on, that something that gave him hope was like how in disasters people come together. I think a lot of times people come together when they have common cause, when we make common cause, when we have something we're collaborating on, and we all bring something like, oh, I know first aid, I can clean water, I can do dishes. Like, we have these different skills or roles, and we come together with function. One area I think that we come apart a lot of times is when we cease collaborating on goal, on something that we're working in collectively on, and we try to make each other better or right. Like, yes, come join our group and you can be more, more progressive or more like woke, or you can be more the thing. Like, yes, we'll collaborate, and in our collaboration, I'm going to tell you how you have to be. Or like, yes, we're going to collaborate, but only if you are this way. So I want to like adjust, And I know personally, I'm resistant to that. I bristle when I'm in a group and like, oh, people are like, oh, you need to be this. Like, oh, I brought this, this is what I have to offer. And like, no, but you have to be this way to offer that. So my question is like, when you come into a group, think about for yourself. When you come into a group and you have all these identities, like which ones do you bring, and where is there space for one? Where do we get to celebrate that? And how do we allow that to come in to further our goals and our causes, versus requiring everybody to bring those gifts in only one way? Have you ever been in a community or organization where that's true? Maybe it's your family. Like, can you show up with all of your identities when you go to Thanksgiving dinner? Or there's some identities you have to check at the door, or like, if you go to work or if you go hang out with your friends, like which of your identities can you bring? And how do we create space for this? How do you create space for other people in your community to bring these identities? So these are things that come up for me when I think about how do we come together? Like, how do we make common cause without it having to be a particular way? How do we come together and be like, oh yeah, we all have these different maybe political ideologies, but we all know if we don't work together, our houses might burn down. What is it that can bring us together and allow us to make common cause, to like find those things that we can do together? So that's what comes up to me when I think about like, how do we come together? What are your thoughts, Star?
Yeah, I think a lot about how do we organize for diversity. And I'm out here in the woods, and in our community, we've come together over the last couple of years to do work around our forests, of thinning and pruning and limbing up and doing fuel reduction to help reduce the fire danger, because we've had such devastating wildfires in the last 5 or 10 years here in California. And to me, that's been a wonderful experience. Throughout COVID, it brought people together in a way where we could be outdoors, we could have social interactions. We could be doing something productive and helpful, and being in beautiful places. We're really fortunate to live in such a beautiful place. And we weren't asking, like, what are your politics? Or, do you know the proper way to say everything that we want you to say? We were just doing the work together. And I think in general, that's one of the principles we can use, that if you want to organize people across gaps of difference, organize them around doing something. It could be clearing your roadsides. It could be doing a prescribed burn. It could be a cleanup. It could be anything that people are actually doing, rather than organizing people just to sit and talk and discuss. Because that is one of the ways that we create or we generate a lot of conflict, is when we're lost in our head, right? And not in our body, not getting that sense of impact and agency in the world that we get from doing work. And I like to talk about some of our basic needs. But before I can do that, I need to make sure my computer is being plugged in, because it's telling me it has a basic need for getting the battery charged, which for some reason is not happening.
While you're doing
So
that, maybe I'll talk a little about a piece while you're getting plugged in. So, I'll leave the basic needs. Tara, come back to that. One of the areas that when we come together, so I think there's this organic gathering where you gather groups of people and you have common cause, and we can work, working on clearing the debris from the roads, up on Stars Ranch to keep the fires from coming through. Everybody has a vested interest, regardless of your politics. And because fire doesn't care about your politics, it goes where it's going to go. So you want to keep the debris and, and open up the forest where you can get the fire defense in. So that's an easy common cause. But there's times where we get together where we need to create spaces that are inviting. So if you want to get a more diverse group, you're going to have a more diverse community that comes in. You're going to have a meeting. You say, okay, so let's have a meeting. So we're going to invite everybody. And you're like, well, we want to have a more diverse community to come to this thing. How do you create a safe space? How do you create a space so that people can come into it? And how do you start to create those safe spaces or safer spaces, or spaces that are just inviting, whether you call them safe or not, so that you can bring in more people. So I see you, Rexstar. So I'll come back to that. How do we create space? But basic needs, I think you're going to.
Well, I think safety is one of them. Maybe the primary one. We need to feel safe. And of course, when we're talking about organizing, obviously we'd like to feel physically safe, but I've also done a lot of organizing of people and around things like doing direct action and doing protests that were quite dangerous. Even, Charles and I have both been in situations where we've been organizing people to go up against military forces in the occupied West Bank, and places where things were being blown up around us and people were being shot and killed, and it wasn't safe. But the safety is more the emotional safety. It's the safety of knowing other people in the group have my back, and I can take a risk because I know that I've got support and solidarity. And I think when I've worked in groups that have a kind of ethic of solidarity, of saying, hey, if we go to jail, we're going to stay in jail to make sure that everybody gets charged the same and some people don't get singled out and targeted. Or if you go to jail, we're going to be there when you come out with hot tea or coffee and blankets. And there was a time we always used to have peanut M&Ms, but later we became more health conscious. However, I will always have a fondness for peanut M&Ms. You know, a little carb, a little protein, right? You know, it's that kind of spirit that I think gives people a sense of emotional safety. And I think too often we try to assure safety in group by making a whole lot of rules about what not to do or what not to say. You know, with the best of intent, the intent that we don't want to create harm or discomfort. But I think that that effort often backfires because as soon as you are in the realm of rules and enforcement and punishment and authority, you're actually in a realm that isn't terribly safe for people. You're in a realm that people are used to. You know, it's the world we live in a lot of the time, but a world in which you are constantly being judged rather than being accepted. You know, it's an art to think about how do we hold people accountable without immediately threatening them with punishment if they don't do what we want. And yet I think most of the time it's far more effective. You know, for example, I've often been in a lot of groups where they start with a safe space statement saying, you know, we won't tolerate any kind of racism or sexism or, you know, sexual harassment, you know, and list a whole bunch of things they don't want. And by the end of it, you're like, really? Yeah. I didn't realize I was coming into a place where people were likely to jump out of the showers and sexually harass me and call me racial epithets. But I guess like this is where I'm at if they don't have rules against it. And I think actually people end up feeling more unsafe. What I like to do when I open a group, often I'll say, hey, you know, we think sex is a good thing. You know, I'm a pagan. We think sexuality is sacred. It's wonderful. We want to create a space where people are free to say yes and free to say no. And we also recognize that this is an area where a lot of people carry deep wounds. So who here is willing to be an ally for someone if something comes up? If they need help, if they need support. And generally everybody raises their hands. And then people look around and they feel supported. And they feel like they have allies and they feel like they can be allies. And to me, that's what creates safety. We can never guarantee that nobody is ever going to do something to make you uncomfortable or to hurt you or hurt your feelings or say something unconsciously may be offensive. But what we can guarantee is that we can stand behind you to address it and to change it and to move forward.
Yeah, and we see this often in our courses where we'll be teaching a course and you know we'll go through a set of like ground rules and guidelines at the beginning of the course, or you know, at some point we'll go through these and sometimes people are very like adamant we need to have these and go through a long process, and those processes it's interesting. You get this long list of like thou shall, thou shall not, and like you know we make the list of the ground rules. And very soon after that, you know, you have these giant puppy piles of people that are like lounging all over, and you see like nobody's asking anybody. They're all kind of piled together, and you're like, "Hey, can you pay attention in class?" They're like, "No, we're lounging together. We're great over here." You know, so but what happens is sometimes in the process of making the ground rules is where the community building happens, right? It's not so much the rule that everybody's going through. Whether it is, we did this process together where now I can trust you. I heard what you had to say. You heard what I had to say. I saw that you listened to me. And then we went for a walk, and we had this great conversation. We really bonded about this thing, and like, yeah, now we don't have to do all that very formal process, because we did this thing that like bonded us. I've been in communities where like we'll make a smoking policy, or like a clothing policy or something, and you'll make it with everybody there, and you come up with the policy, and then 3 new people come in, and then you have to revisit the policy and like, do it every season, and you always come up with the same policy because it's kind of what makes sense, but like you always do it. And the old timers like roll their eyes like, we've done this policy a dozen times, but we need to do it, right? Times where the process of making our guidelines gives us community. So the question is like, what builds community? Like, how do we create those spaces? And I think a lot of it comes through engagement, through trust, through building trust, through activities. Like, should we do something successful together? Sometimes that's making rules, but I think we can do it other ways too. We can build a sense of safety and trust and collaboration by doing things successful. I think that's a need that we do have. That is like that we're able to work together and have success, and be able to move forward and not be stuck in like just our head or just our physical work. But like, we're able to get together, and so sometimes I think the ground rules are really important in themselves, but other times I think it's the process that's important because it builds that sense of affiliative connection. And we always have the ground rules to fall back on, right? Which is one of the great things. They give us guidelines for when behavior becomes, we fall off that. Oh yeah, remember we made this agreement. Okay, we can call ourselves back to a state of being, but it's that creation process that I think can be very important. As we build this, and that's what we see in the environment too. Like ecology, the diversity of ecology, diverse environments take time to build. You look at an old growth forest, it takes hundreds of years to get them as that diverse. In our gardens, the more that we know, the more diverse, our gardens and our landscapes can be. But it takes time to build that, right, successfully. So I think there is a piece around like, how do we create safety? So I'd be curious, so your thoughts around ground rules and like how they function, and when they work well, or when they're impediment to diversity. When do they function? When do they don't?
Well, I tend to agree with you that they work well as a commitment to a set of values. And they work less well when they come across as a set of ultimatums. Like, you will be ejected if you don't follow these rules. And that's partly because another one of those really core needs we have is the need to feel like we belong to something. And successful movements and groups and permaculture groups and communities generate a sense of belonging in a positive way. I mean, it's relatively easy to generate a sense of belonging by identifying some group that doesn't belong, pointing the finger and saying, you are out, you are not human, right? And we see that happening with this rise of, neo-fascism again, and white supremacy, and these really horrific, blatant racist ideologies. And we're all susceptible to kind of going, well, our group, we are the in group and you are the out group. But I think we can also create very positive senses of belonging when we have something worth belonging to, and when we have some markers that say you are part of us. Welcome. And the rainbow family is famous for kind of welcoming you in by saying, welcome home, sister and brother, right? That may be a little too on the nose for a lot of us, but it also, that spirit, I like to think of movements that are successful. When I've been involved, when I think of some of the really powerful movements we built, maybe 20 years ago around anti-globalization, where we'd have a convergence and you'd walk in and in a few moments, you'd have a meal, you'd have medical care if you needed it, you'd have jobs to do in ways that you could contribute. and you would have the opportunity to join in something that you felt was making an impact on the world. Because that's another one of our core needs, I think, is to feel like we have some sort of impact on the world around us. We have some sort of effect. And in its positive form, I think we long to make a contribution to the community that we're in, and then be seen and be valued. And valued not just for some of the superficial aspects of who we are, of our identity, the things we can't control. It's good to have representation, but nobody wants to be the token Black person, in the room who's there because of your skin color and nothing else. You want to be seen for the whole full human being that you are, for all of your different capacities, and have a chance to exercise them. So again, I think when we organize in community, it's one of the reasons I love organizing around actually doing stuff. Because when you're actually doing stuff, it gives people something to do. And ways to have that impact and ways to make a contribution. And I was often amazed in some of those mobilizations how, with no central coordination, people would show up and there would be a team of medics, and there would be a media team, and there would be a team of legal advisors. And it's not like somebody dispatched them all from some central, activist warehouse. It was like the emergent properties of the movement called them together and then created multiple niches where people could find a place to fit in and find a place, again, to make a contribution.
The other part of that I really enjoyed, as you say at start, is the way in which I watched over successive mobilizations, where you watch somebody come in and they're like, oh, they hung out with the medics, and the next time they were a medic. And then, you saw them as medic, and then you showed up somewhere a year later and they were on the legal team because they were the only one who had done any of the legal training at some other point. So you saw people like diversify their skills, and when they came into a space, they said, where can I be? Like I have this diversity of skills. Oh, now this is what's being called for. There's a lot of those people, but I can help do this because somebody needs to work for food, not bombs, and I cook the food. And the next time they might be doing a different set of skills. Some people really stuck in their realm that they got really good at, but other people learned a number of different skills. And when we had disasters like Katrina, it was amazing to see people turn out that had been going to these mobilizations and had picked up a lot of skills and then applied them for disaster response because they had learned all this stuff along the way. Like, it was a really great example of kind of collection of the building of a movement with really no direction. There's nobody directing it at all.
Yeah, after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the people who came down to help in a certain organization called Common Ground Relief, that was a very grassroots organization. A lot of them came out of activist circles. And so we had like a medical clinic that was up and running a month before the Red Cross even showed up in town. That was staffed by people who'd learned their skills as street medics. And I think when we think about organizing community, there's so much scope in community for people to do things, to create things. There's a wonderful feeling when people are working together towards some kind of common aim and common good. So again, if you're all getting together to build a garden or to do a prescribed burn and make your community safer, nobody's quizzing you about your politics or your ideology. You're just there, and you're able to contribute in the way you contribute and have that be valuable and be a part of this larger effort. I think finally, one of the things that people need and long for is a sense of meaning and purpose in life. a way to make sense of what in life is often so much senselessness and suffering, and feeling that you are, you're on the right team to make it better. And again, when we organize around permaculture, when we organize around regenerative projects, I think that's a very powerful way of giving people that sense of being part of something that means something. And, Chris was talking about young people. I was listening to a podcast the other day by Andrew Solomon, who's a psychologist who works with young people and is writing a book on suicide among young people. And he was saying a lot of the suicide comes, it's not really about bullying or about lack of love or the things you think it's about. A lot of young people really feel like there's no meaning or purpose to their life. That with climate change and with everything else, the world is becoming a much grimmer and dangerous and difficult place, and that they feel hopeless about changing it and making it better. So I think giving people the opportunities to do concrete things that actually make it better can be a very powerful way, not just of organizing, but also of healing.
I'm noticing our time, and did we want to pivot briefly to talk about some of the structural challenges to diversifying? When we look at landscapes, one of the challenges I think we have sometimes is that it's like you create it, they will come, which is true sometimes. Like you create it and they'll come. Like you create spaces and like diversity will show up. But sometimes the diversity isn't what you're looking for, or there's particular things that are rare, that are hard, and the only way you get them there is by like inviting them in. You create a little nutrient pocket, you get the shade right, you get the water right, you water it for a couple of years, you engage to bring in the diversity. You're like, oh, well, like we want some things to come back, especially things that are rare in our environment. I think when we talk about diversity, you can get a lot of the common things to come in. Like, okay, so I don't have, thistle. Like that's easy to invite in. You can invite thistle in. If you don't have it, it'll create space, it'll come. But then there's other things that are harder. You get non-natives that come in sometimes easily, or some invasives that are coming easily. But then some of your fragile natives take a little more tending. That you need to create the space. You need to look at what the structural lack is around it ecologically to bring in some of those plants or some of those animals. Like you really need to create an environment that's hospitable. And I think that's true in our social groups too. Like when we look at like what we do, kids, can we make meaningful work? Can we like create our communities where they're open to a variety, like doing all those things? Sometimes even that isn't enough. And I don't know if we want to pivot to work in that direction for a little bit in our last, I think we got another 15, 20 minutes or something. If you want to talk in that.
Yeah. There's a principle I like about in permaculture that I call feed what you want to grow. It's the idea that you create the conditions that are going to favor what you want rather than trying to attack and destroy what you don't want. In the garden, if you don't want pests, and you say, I'm going to go use my bug spray and kill them, what you end up doing is killing the ones who are susceptible, and then the ones who are less susceptible survive and breed and develop resistance. And you end up killing a lot of the beneficial bugs that might have kept the plant eaters in check, and you end up with a worse pest problem. I think the same can be true in social permaculture. We say, we don't want these behaviors. We're going to outlaw them. We're going to cancel them. We're going to eject them. And they have a funny way of coming in through the back door. And biting you in the behind. But if instead you say in the garden, well, I'm going to look at, why am I getting these pests? Maybe it's because my plants are lacking a nutrient, and so they're more susceptible. And maybe if I feed them that nutrient, I'm going to create an environment that is not so favorable to the plant-eating bugs and more favorable. Maybe I need to plant some more flowers that are going to attract the beneficials. So I can change the environment again to favor what I want and discourage what I don't want. And I think we need to think more about that socially. Are there ground rules? Are there structures? Are there ways we can organize that favor the kind of behaviors we want rather than the behaviors we don't want? A lot of people have written about the internet and Facebook and social media and how the very algorithms, the actual structure of them, favors conflict and divisiveness and hatred and outrageousness, because that creates engagement, and that's what they run on. So how could we design systems that instead favor cooperation and understanding and compassion? What does that look like? And how do we create those kinds of structures and expectations?
I think also in this like feed what you want to grow aspect, some of what we've been doing in Earth Actors training is trying to diversify the permaculture movement with a really kind of clear goal of that being people of color, indigenous people, like really trying to figure out how to do that. And so it's listening, really listening to what people say they need. Like economics, like, when is there a barrier? Like, oh, we want to invite people in, but it's too costly. Like, can we decrease the economic barrier? Can we create so we do a lot of fundraising. We have a fundraiser coming up, an Earth Day fundraiser that helps us do this. Like, we're able, we put our energy to fundraising so that we can create space, because people said, there's a barrier there to entry. We've had, really wanting to increase the deaf community that has access to permaculture, because there's really not a lot out there. And that, getting interpreters, like bringing that in, bringing in people to help create that space. What do we want to grow? Well, we're going to create that. Diversify our teaching pool. So we have other instructors coming on from diverse backgrounds. So I think there's a fair bit of that is really important in, we talk about creating diversity in our movements, is hearing what people say they need and then acting on it and inviting, those communities to have a say in creating the structures that invite people in. So I think there's a part of that. So we do these other pieces that I think help the community that is similar to us and that allow for the flowering and diversity that's within our community, which I think is really important. And then I think to bring, diversity from outside of our community, pieces that we don't have, sometimes really require some structural changes that can be uncomfortable, can be kind of hard at times, and bump edges of like, this is the way we do it, or we've always done it this way. And sometimes we just can't always do it that way anymore. And need to adjust and really listen to what people need, and the needs change over time, which is the other part that I think we found is that, like, oh, this worked 10 years ago, but really people have different needs now. Like a diverse community isn't a static, like, oh, this is what it needs and that's how it's going to work. But it's like a very dynamic relationship, building those relationships. And you've done quite a bit of it with some of the Hunter's Point and some of the other pieces, Star. I don't know if you're going to talk to some of the successful things that you found.
Yeah, we are struggling with the question of being part of a permaculture movement, which we thought had great skills and tools to offer, that had an ethos of valuing diversity. And yet, at least in the United States, looking around, I'm talking 10, 15 years ago, it was not very diverse in terms of race and heritage. It tended to be dominated a lot by white men who were good with machines, and God bless them. I love them. They're great with those machines, and that's important. And it's really a gift and a great way. There's no better way to use testosterone, I say, than to get out there and regenerate landscape, move those rocks, and dig those holes. But there were also women in the movement who were not being seen. There were communities of color who we felt would be interested and would benefit, but who weren't being represented. There were indigenous folks, and permaculture draws so much on indigenous wisdom and practices that it seemed like they should be much more in the forefront of the movement. So we began working with organizations in San Francisco, where I live, inner city, groups that had these community gardens that had been started in the 70s, and many of them had kind of gone dormant or been overgrown, and they were trying to bring them back, and they didn't have a lot of gardening experience and knowledge. So I just would show up and say, well, I'll volunteer and I'll teach you some things and we'll work together. And over a few years of doing that, what we actually did was we built relationships. And that's important. You know, a lot of people want to say, we want to diversify. How can we bring in more Black people or more young people or more, and, can you get us some? Our friend Pandora, who teaches with us at Earth Activist Training and who started the Black permaculture movement, she said people were always calling her up saying, like, well, we're having this convergence tomorrow and we don't have any people of color. Can you bring us some Black people and some youth? And she's like, no, I don't keep stables of them. If you want them involved, you need to involve them meaningfully. And that, I think, is one of the keys about diversity. That's not just difference for the sake of difference. It's got to be functional diversity. It's like you don't plant a cactus in the middle of a redwood forest for the sake of diversity, because it's not going to work. It's not going to have any functional relationship. You have to find something that works within those parameters and is going to actually contribute to the system and give it the opportunity to contribute to the system. So whether that's a garden you're planting or whether that's a conference you're organizing, if you want to bring in people of color, bring them in from the organizing point of view, from the beginning. Let them help shape the conference and the agenda and the topics and the people who get invited to it. And that's going to mean relinquishing power for some people. But that's another one of the permaculture principles. It might mean doing something really different than your original vision. But it might actually end up richer and deeper than your original vision. And so after a few years of working together, somehow or other, one winter I ended up with a grant that came in late and we had some extra money. And I said, I'm just going to offer some scholarships for people of color and indigenous folks. It's kind of our way of making reparations. And we did. And suddenly we had people taking us up on it because we had built relationships. And that was maybe 10 years ago or more now. Since that time, we've probably had dozens, if not hundreds, of indigenous folks and people of color coming through our Earth Activist trainings. And now, if you go to Convergence, we haven't had any really because of COVID for the last couple of years in person here in California. But the last one before COVID, I just remember looking around and going, wow, this is a really diverse group. And many of these people have come through our Earth Activist Training Program. And I felt very proud of that and very gratified, because having a more diverse group of people involved in the permaculture movement is going to give it more depth and breadth and intelligence, because it's going to have many more different perspectives for viewing the world. Well, we're kind of coming down to the wire now, Charles. Is there more that you wanted to offer or say, or we should address?
I don't have anything. Maybe if Chris, sometimes he has some questions. He's been in the background, so, or maybe there's other things, but I don't have much more to add. We've covered a lot of ground. Or people have questions, they can put it in the chat. Is the other thing. If you have questions about things we've said or thoughts, you can put those in the chat. Or Chris has out there, and he wants to toss a couple questions in. We have a few minutes left. Give people a chance to get to the chat.
For a second here, I guess the question that I would ask here then is, for folks that are, can you hear me? Am I coming through? Yes, okay. I just had a little pause there. Just thinking, you know, for folks that have been feeling a little bit of the stress of the social divide in their community right now, and they're, you know, wanting to do something to build bridges. I feel like there was actually a ton of gems that I already took away from tonight. I was definitely making some notes in the background there. So thank you so much for everything that you shared this evening. But I'm just thinking about, you know, tangible first steps. Like you mentioned some big things, like, you know, you could go do a controlled burn, or you could do you know, a big permaculture project, but those are massive jobs. You know, people that are wanting to start breaking down barriers and pulling people together in their community, and starting to kind of weave that web of resiliency. Any other thoughts on just, like, you know, first steps on starting to organize something in the community that works in that direction, but maybe isn't quite as grandiose as the controlled burn or the permaculture project?
Well, you could start with like a garden assistance day. You know, of just, you know what, we're going to get together each week or each month and go to somebody's garden, and we'll all work together and, you know, help you with the weeding. Or maybe we'll see some of the elders in our community, and maybe we'll cook a meal for them or plant a garden for them. You know, I think it comes out of what your community needs. I mean, you've done so much organizing around emergency preparedness, and I think that's one of the great ways to link people up, and involve people across those barriers, because everybody has an interest in being prepared for the natural disasters, which are coming thick and fast these days. You know, organizing something around kids and schools, or something that brings people together and that people have in common. And yeah, it doesn't have to be an enormous project. It can be a small thing. But again, it's that thing of, I would think, like, being a good organizer is like being a good hostess at a party. It's about, you know, inviting people, you know, thinking about who you're going to invite, and making sure you don't leave somebody out that really should be invited in. Creating interesting things for people to do, activities, circulating around, making sure people feel comfortable. Right. All of those, you know, very mundane skills are actually the skills of community organizing.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Star. And you shared a lot of great tips just around, you know, how to make that kind of a space that's less likely to have conflict in the first place. Maybe I'll just share one little piece from my work and some of the stuff I've done around the emergency preparedness gathering, because I've consulted with a lot of groups and communities around, say, holding like a community barbecue or a community get together. And I think this kind of builds off of what you and Charles were sharing, that because we know that there is social tension and there's potential for conflict, you know, often we have these big ideas like, I want to accomplish this goal through the gathering. And I often encourage people to actually kind of lighten up on the goal a little bit for the initial gathering, you know, and really create something that's actually more just about having fun, you know, whether it's fun around food and music, or whether it's like a project that we're going to all go and work on. And then you almost like think of it as like your secret scout mission for the night is to be like, okay, you know, what are people actually interested in? What are they drawn to? You know, where might people kind of clash? And then you can kind of schedule the next follow-up pieces with a little bit of intel and try and set yourself up for success. And like, maybe I want to have a gathering around emergency preparedness and we want to talk about how we support each other. Or maybe there is some social cause or issue that I want to bring, but I don't necessarily have to mention that the first time we all get together, especially when I don't know people and I don't know how it's going to be received. I can actually build relationships first before trying to project my desire onto people, you know. And I think that's, you know, in the spirit of like almost permaculture, the spirit of observation first, you know, observe and interact. So to hold a gathering where we're actually going to interact with each other with no hidden objective, we're going to observe, we're going to have fun, we're going to build real relationship. And then to come back to the drawing board with, okay, now where could we actually go with this in this direction? And what new ideas might I have coming out of it from that interaction? I thought I'd maybe just share that little piece.
I think
That's cool. Yeah.
the piece that I'd add is we don't have, you know, we have a leaderful group here. Like, let's get this thing done. There's, you know, goals, things that we're going to do. But there's an equally valuable thing is showing up in communities that that you want to connect with and offering to do the dishes, offering to help out. Like, there's a really valuable piece to be like, oh, I want to bring lots of people to my cause. Sometimes the best way to get people to your cause is actually to go help somebody else in their cause, or even be like, I don't have a cause, but I see a struggling community. I'm going to show up. Like, I'm, you know, like there, you know, is there community meetings, you know, at libraries, council meetings, read the flyers that they nailed to the walls, the telephone poles and on notice boards. Like, there's so much going on, and just showing up in other people's community and being like, how can I help? And that being it. Like, that's a huge gift to a community, and it builds a lot of capacity. Just showing up and helping, because that's the relational piece. Like, especially communities that are heavily involved, like where I'm right now, the Indigenous community is always being asked to show up. Can someone Indigenous? Like, they're like, no, there's not that many of us. Like, you do the work. Like, it's not our thing, you know. But you know, there are things that need help. Like showing up and helping. Like, just showing up when, you know, there's calls to action. You know, they're all over. There's lots of those. You know, get on Facebook, get on Instagram. You know, read the newsletters from your local organizations that put out their newsletters. But there's always a place that we need.
That's brilliant, Charles. And you know what I was just thinking there? You know, if you've got a neighbor down the road that you know you might clash ideologically with, maybe the starting point is like after a big snowstorm. You know, if you live in a place with snow, is like, hey, just go over and shovel snow and talk, and don't bring up anything political, and build a relationship first, and then you might actually have a chance at having a real conversation. You know, because if you dive right into the politics and start fighting, you're probably not going to change them. And you know, you're maybe not open to change yourself. But if you go and shovel the snow with them, help them out, get to know each other on a personal level, then maybe there's room for a real conversation there. So.
And Jocelyn, I saw your comment, and I want to applaud you for having the courage to do something you haven't done before and step out and put yourself out there to organize people. And I would say you may not have organized people in that way before, but I would bet anything that in your life you've thrown a party or you've had people come over for dinner, or you've been in a situation where people didn't know each other and you helped introduce them and make them feel comfortable. And if you think about it like that, maybe it's not so intimidating. It's like, what can you do to help people get to know each other and get comfortable? You know, I often like to start with some way that people can introduce themselves to each other or some kind of icebreaker. You can be honest with people and say, hey, I haven't organized anything before, but this is why I feel passionate about this, and this is why I want to do it. And think about some of the things you might want to get people together to do. And I bet that it will be a wonderful success.
So we're coming up on 9:30 right now, and it would be good to wrap. But Starhawk and Charles, what does Earth Activist Training have coming up? Anything that would be good just to put on folks' radar? I know you folks do all kinds of cool events, both free offerings as well as paid courses that go more in depth. What's coming up with Earth Activists that would be interesting for people to know that want to dive a little bit deeper?
So some of the things coming up. First up, if you go to our webpage, earthactivisttraining.org, there's a list of all of our events that are coming up. The big ones coming up is we have an Earth Day week that has, we're going to talk about mycelium and mushrooms in the environment. We're going to have talk about how to connect with Earth practices for connection with the Earth and doing work with it. Star's doing a book series or a book reading and discussion. And Star, you might want to say about that.
Well, it's not my book, but I'm going to be on a panel with Hazel Varda, who's a wonderful forester from Southern Oregon, who's written a great book on social forestry. And we're going to be talking together on April 20th about their book and about grief and ecological grief and how we respond in this moment.
Other things that are coming up, we have an Introduction to Permaculture course that is April 25th to May 9th. It's 3 consecutive evenings. And it'll just be a beginner's permaculture 3-day course. If you're interested, it's by donation. We'd love to have folks join us. We have also our regenerative land design course in May. We're going to have our session on soils and animals. So if you're interested in kind of advanced permaculture that focuses on more soils in detail and how animals can be used in our regenerative systems, this is a 3-part series. We're in the middle part. You can take the parts separately, so you can just join for that or take all 3. Great course, delving deeper into some of the science and tools for earth healing.
And I'll also say that we have a course running right now on permaculture for climate activists. We're going into our 3rd of 3 sessions, but it has been recorded. So if people want to join still, you could. And we will run that again, I think, next fall as well.
Yeah.
I have a course on ritual skills. And it's ongoing. I've done 1 session, but again, you can watch. If you want to join now, you can watch the recording of the 1st session, and we'll be doing the 2nd session next week.
And they can find that at starhawk.org?
Yeah, they can find those on starhawk.org. I also, every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, I do a short meditation on Instagram. It's online and free. You're welcome to that. So we should say thank you now. Thank you to Spirit. Thank you to Earth and Water and Fire and Air. Charles, I think you need to mute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you to Chris for this inspiring series and for all the incredible work that you do. And thank you to Charles for all of our wonderful co-teaching and all the work you do in Earth Activist Training to keep it going and make it happen. And thank you to the whole Earth Activist team and the whole Chris Outdoors team that do all the technical and the promotional and the administrative work that often people don't see, but without that, none of this really happens. And we like to say our circle now is open, but unbroken. And merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see you again next Tuesday with Andrew McMartin from the Pine Project talking about resiliency in youth and connecting with nature. And then the following week with Caleb Musgrave and Laura Gilmore talking about modern day small scale homesteading and foraging as a supplementation to food security. Until then, safe travels, everybody. Good night.
Good night.